the smoke could be seen from 12 miles away. Every ranch across Custer County was burning old grass that morning. Black fire lines crawled across the Oklahoma prairie, while men in denim jackets stood beside water tanks and nodded at one another like they were performing some ancient spring ritual. But right in the middle of all that smoke sat one ranch untouched. Amelia Davis stood alone behind a rusted gate, arms folded while yellow, waist-high grass bent under the wind around her entire pasture. People slowed their trucks just to laugh. Widow finally lost her mind. She's letting the whole ranch rot. At the feed store in Arapahoe, Hank Mercer told everyone Amelia's land would be dead before July. Even County Agent Travis Boone warned her that refusing to burn old grass was the fastest way to suffocate a pasture. Amelia said nothing. She simply bent down, pushed aside the brittle yellow grass, and pressed her fingers into the dark soil underneath. Then she smiled. Now let me pause here for a moment, because the people laughing at Amelia Davis believed clean black dirt meant healthy land. They were about to learn how wrong they were. And if something about this story feels familiar, stay with me. Let me tell you about Amelia Davis before the county started calling her the Grass Widow, because stories like this do not begin with droughts. They begin quietly, usually with two people building something the rest of the world does not fully understand. The Davis Ranch sat 15 miles outside Arapahoe, Oklahoma, where the prairie stretched so wide and flat that storms could be seen arriving an hour before they reached you. 520 acres of native grass, low-rolling pasture cedar breaks, and one narrow creek that only flowed steady during good years. Most ranchers around Custer County measured wealth by herd size. Walter Davis measured it by soil depth. Now sit with that for a moment. Because men like Walter rarely win popularity contests in farm country. Walter had broad shoulders, slow speech, and the habit of kneeling down in pastures while other men talked cattle prices. He could spend 20 minutes rubbing dirt between his fingers while everyone else stood around waiting for him to finish. People respected him, but they did not entirely understand him. Amelia understood him perfectly. She had met Walter Davis in 1979 at a county livestock seminar in Weatherford. Amelia Bennett was 27, then teaching high school biology and still carrying the quiet stubbornness of her father. Harold Bennett, a conservation-minded rancher many locals once mocked for loving grass more than cows. Harold used to tell her something when she was little. Most folks think ranching is about feeding cattle. It ain't. It's about protecting what feeds the cattle. As a child, Amelia barely understood what he meant. As an old woman, those words would save her life. Walter and Amelia built Davis Ranch together over 34 years. Not fast, not flashy, no giant expansions, no risky bank loans, no shiny new trucks every spring like some of the bigger outfits around Clinton and Elk City. They built slowly, carefully, the way prairie roots grow underground before anyone notices them above the surface. Walter fixed fences himself long after his knees started hurting. Amelia kept rainfall journals dating back to the early 1980s. Every year she recorded grass-height cattle weight water levels and temperatures by hand in thick black notebooks stored inside an old cabinet near the kitchen pantry. Nobody knew about the notebooks except Walter, and maybe that was the first mistake the county made after he died. They mistook silence for ignorance. Walter passed away in late October after a brutal fight with pancreatic cancer. By winter, people around Custer County had already started making assumptions about Amelia's future. Widows in rural communities are often treated like storms damaged the property itself. People stop asking what you think. They start asking what you plan to sell. Some assumed Amelia would lease the ranch out by spring. Others figured she would move closer to Wichita, where her son Ethan worked in commercial construction management. A few believed Dean Holloway would eventually buy the whole place. Now Dean Holloway was the kind of rancher who always looked successful from a distance. Big trailers, expensive boots, clean fences. Hundreds of head-grazing, blackened spring pasture every year after controlled burns. Dean loved talking at the coffee counter inside Mercer Feed and Supply. And Dean had opinions about everybody, especially Amelia Davis. "She's too soft for ranching alone," he said one morning while stirring powdered creamer into burnt diner coffee. Hank Mercer laughed. "She'll either sell by summer or lose the place by winter. The others nodded because communities sometimes confuse repetition with truth. Amelia heard about those conversations eventually. Small towns make sure of that. But she never responded. That winter she kept working. Every morning before sunrise, Amelia pulled on Walter's old canvas coat and walked pasture lines alone beneath cold Oklahoma winds that sliced through gloves and denim. She checked fence wire tension herself. Broke ice in water troughs herself. Repaired a busted gate chain with numb fingers during a sleet storm in January. And every single morning before heading back to the house, she stopped near the north pasture and crouched low to inspect the soil beneath last season's dead grass. Not the cattle. The soil. If you're still with me, pay attention to that detail, because almost nobody else in the county was looking downward anymore. They were looking at cattle prices, at diesel prices, at rainfall forecasts. But Amelia was studying the ground itself. One February afternoon, Ethan drove down from Wichita in a silver company pickup coated with highway salt and dust. He stepped into the kitchen carrying grocery bags and worry he tried poorly to hide. Ethan loved his mother, but love and understanding are not always the same thing. "You can't keep doing all this alone," he told her while unpacking canned soup and coffee filters. Amelia kept writing numbers into one of her notebooks. "I'm managing. You're 64 years old. Last time I checked. I'm serious, Mom, so am I." Ethan sighed and leaned against the counter. "You know what people are saying." Amelia finally looked up. "That usually means you're about to tell me. They think the ranch is too much now." Amelia gave the smallest smile imaginable. "The ranch doesn't seem worried about it. That's not funny." "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." The silence between them carried old grief inside it. Walter had only been gone 4 months. The chair near the living room window still leaned slightly to the left, where he used to sit every night reading rainfall reports and extension office bulletins. His boots remained near the mudroom door because Amelia could not yet bring herself to move them. Loss changes the sound inside a house. People who have lived through it know exactly what I mean. Ethan rubbed his forehead. "Maybe lease some of the pasture this year. Reduce the herd. Make things easier." Amelia closed the notebook. Then she asked him a question that stayed with him long after. "Do you know why your father never burned the north pasture 2 years in a row?" Ethan frowned. "What, the north pasture?" Amelia repeated. "Why didn't he burn it every year like Dean Holloway? I don't know." "That's the problem. Now let me pause here." Because Ethan was not a bad son. He simply belonged to a generation raised around the ranch without truly learning how the ranch survived. There's a difference. That evening, Amelia walked outside alone as the sun disappeared red across the prairie horizon. Wind moved through the tall dead grass in long silver waves beneath the fading light. Most ranchers hated seeing old grass. To them it looked messy, unproductive, uncontrolled. But Amelia saw something entirely different. Protection, memory, moisture, life waiting underneath. And far out beyond the fence line, smoke from the first spring burns had already begun rising into the Oklahoma sky. By the second week of March, Custer County smelled like smoke before sunrise. Not wildfire smoke, controlled burn smoke. There's a difference out on the prairie, though outsiders rarely understand it. Every spring, ranchers across western Oklahoma lit fire to old grass the way their fathers had done before them. Flames rolled across dormant pasture in long black ribbons, while pickup trucks crawled along fence lines carrying water tanks and shovels. Men stood in groups watching the fire move. Some called it land management. Others called it prairie cleaning. But if you listened closely enough, especially among older ranchers, there was almost pride in destruction. A burned pasture looked disciplined, orderly, respectable. Black ground meant a man was taking care of his place. And Amelia Davis had become the only rancher in 3 townships refusing to burn. Now let me tell you something about rural communities. People can tolerate poverty. They can tolerate eccentricity. But they do not tolerate someone quietly rejecting tradition without explanation. That makes folks nervous. One windy Thursday morning, Amelia drove into Arapahoe for feed supplies. Her old Ford pickup rattled like loose tools in a metal box every time she crossed the railroad tracks near Main Street. The moment she stepped into Mercer, feed and supply conversation shifted. Not stopped, shifted. That's worse. Hank Mercer stood behind the counter, pouring coffee into a foam cup while 3 ranchers leaned nearby, discussing burn schedules. Dean Holloway glanced toward Amelia's mud-covered boots and smirked. "Well," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "there's the only woman in Oklahoma trying to ranch under a compost pile." A few men laughed. Amelia kept walking. She grabbed mineral blocks, fencing staples, and 2 bags of range cubes without looking at anyone. Dean wasn't finished. "You planning to graze cattle or rabbits this year?" More laughter. Hank shook his head slowly. "Truth is, Amelia, you ought to burn before that dead grass smothers everything." Amelia finally looked up. Her face stayed calm. That almost irritated them more. "Grass doesn't smother prairie," she said quietly. Dean snorted. "Tell that to the weeds growing all over your north pasture." Now sit with that moment for a second. Because humiliation in small towns is rarely explosive. It's casual, public, designed to remind you where the social boundary lines are. Amelia paid for her supplies without another word and carried them outside herself while laughter drifted through the feed store doorway behind her. Not once did she defend herself. Not once did she explain. And that silence slowly began driving people crazy. 3 days later, County Agent Travis Boone pulled into Davis Ranch wearing a tan extension office jacket and mirrored sunglasses that reflected the prairie back at itself. Travis was younger than most ranchers in the county. Early 40s, educated at Oklahoma State. Smart enough to understand data, but still ambitious enough to care what local cattlemen thought about him. He respected Walter Davis, but Amelia worried him. They stood beside the north pasture fence while dry wind rolled through waist-high dead grass. "You know why I'm here," Travis said. "I figured eventually somebody would send you. That pasture should have been burned weeks ago." Amelia studied the field. "No," she said softly. "It shouldn't have." Travis sighed. "You're risking reduced forage production." "Maybe. You'll lose spring greenup. Maybe. The dead residue traps fungal growth and blocks sunlight." Amelia turned toward him. "Did you measure that yourself?" He hesitated. "No, but did you?" Travis shifted uncomfortably. Because the dangerous thing about quiet people is that they force loud people to think before speaking. Amelia crouched near the fence line and pushed aside brittle grass stems until dark soil appeared underneath. Moist, cool. She handed him a thermometer probe. "Check the surface temperature." Travis frowned, but did it anyway. Then Amelia pointed toward the neighboring burned pasture across the road. "Now check theirs." The difference wasn't enormous, but it existed. Travis stared at the readings. "Temperature changes during spring aren't unusual." "No," Amelia agreed. "They aren't." "Still," he said carefully, "the county recommends controlled burns for a reason." Amelia stood slowly. Sometimes counties recommend what everybody already believes. That irritated him. Not because she was rude, because some part of him suspected she might be right. If you're still with me, remember Travis Boone. Men like him become important later in stories like this, because truth usually reaches skeptical people in stages. First discomfort, then doubt, then silence. That weekend smoke covered nearly the entire county. Burn crews worked sunrise to dark. Helicopters occasionally crossed the horizon, helping monitor larger prescribed fires west of Clinton. Ash drifted through roadside ditches like black snow. And right in the middle of all of it stood the Davis Ranch. Yellow, unburned, mocked. Church gossip picked up momentum by Sunday morning. Inside the Fellowship Baptist parking lot after service, women gathered near pickup trucks discussing Amelia the way communities discuss approaching storms. "She's grieving wrong. She always thought she was smarter than everybody. Walter kept that place together. Lord knows what'll happen now." One woman even whispered that Amelia's refusal to burn was probably emotional attachment after Walter's death, as though dead grass itself had become some kind of widow's denial. Now let me pause here. Because people often create emotional explanations when they cannot understand disciplined thinking. It comforts them. If Amelia was irrational, then nobody needed to question their own methods. Meanwhile, Amelia spent Sunday afternoon repairing cross-fencing alone beneath gray skies, while radio reports warned of worsening dry conditions across western Oklahoma. Rainfall totals were already lower than average, wind stronger than usual, subsoil moisture declining. Most ranchers responded by preparing for harder grazing conditions. Amelia responded by protecting more cover. That week, she divided another pasture into smaller rotational sections using temporary wire fencing Walter had purchased years earlier. Dean Holloway saw her working while driving past. He stopped his truck near the gate. "You building a maze out here?" Amelia kept tightening wire, moving cattle slower. Dean laughed. "You're starving your grass while everybody else is greening up." "No," Amelia said calmly. "I'm protecting roots." Dean spat into the dirt. "Roots don't matter if there's no rain." Amelia finally looked at him directly. "They matter most when there isn't." For a moment, Dean said nothing. Then he drove away, shaking his head. But that night, sitting alone at his kitchen table, even Dean noticed something uncomfortable. He could not stop thinking about her answer. Because deep down, experienced ranchers know something many outsiders never learn. The land eventually exposes who truly understands it. And out on the prairie, exposure sometimes takes years, sometimes decades. But it always comes. Late that evening, Amelia sat at the kitchen table beside Walter's old lamp, opening another black notebook. Rainfall records, soil temperatures, grass recovery rates. Her handwriting stretched across 14 years of observations most people in Custer County never knew existed. Outside the window, smoke still drifted across the moonlit prairie. And somewhere beyond that smoke drought was already coming. Most people just didn't know it yet. Let me tell you something most people never understand about the prairie. What looks dead is often alive, and what looks clean can already be dying underneath. Amelia Davis learned that lesson before she was old enough to drive a truck. Back when she was 9 years old, her father, Harold Bennett, used to wake her before sunrise and take her walking through tall grass pasture outside Dodge City, Kansas. Other ranchers burned aggressively every spring back then, too. Harold didn't. That alone made him suspicious in the eyes of neighbors. But Harold Bennett was the kind of man who trusted observation more than popularity. He carried a coffee can filled with soil everywhere he went. No, I'm serious. The old man would scoop dirt from different pastures, bring it home, dry it on newspaper sheets across the kitchen table, then compare texture, smell, and moisture retention like a scientist trapped inside a rancher's body. People laughed at him for it, especially during drought years. Harold studies dirt while the rest of us work, one rancher once joked at a livestock auction. Amelia remembered hearing that when she was 12. She also remembered what happened 3 summers later, when half the county started hauling emergency hay, while Harold's pasture stayed green 2 weeks longer than everyone else's. That was the thing about men ahead of their time. The apology usually arrived years after the insult, sometimes decades. Harold taught Amelia how native prairie functioned beneath the surface. He explained that old grass wasn't merely leftover vegetation. It was armor, protection against evaporation, protection against erosion, protection against heat. He showed her how moisture survived longer under covered soil, how earthworms stayed active beneath residue, how roots from old grasses fed invisible biological systems underground long after cattle stopped grazing the surface. Most ranchers manage what they can see, Harold told her once while kneeling beside buffalo grass. The smart ones manage what they can't. Amelia never forgot that. Neither did Walter Davis. The first time Amelia explained prairie ecology to Walter, after they got married, he listened without interrupting for almost an hour. That alone made him different from most men she knew. Walter wasn't threatened by knowledge. He respected it. Years later, they experimented quietly on a small 40-acre north pasture nobody paid much attention to. One season, they skipped burning entirely, while surrounding ranches blackened their fields like always. At first, the pasture looked terrible, uneven, messy, ugly. The the kind of field neighbors pointed at while shaking their heads. But by midsummer, Walter noticed something strange. The ground beneath the standing dead grass stayed cooler. Native grasses remained greener longer. Water runoff slowed after storms. And during a particularly dry August, cattle continued grazing that pasture after others had already started thinning out. Walter became obsessed after that. Not publicly, privately. That mattered, because rural communities often punish people who question inherited methods, so Walter and Amelia kept studying quietly. Every season, they recorded observations in black notebooks stored inside the kitchen cabinet near the pantry. Rainfall totals, grazing pressure, root depth measurements, surface temperatures, recovery rates after dry spells, 14 years of data, not theories. Not internet opinions, observations. Now let me pause here for a moment, because this is where the story truly separates itself from simple stubbornness. Amelia was not refusing to burn because she hated change. She was refusing because she had spent years watching the land respond differently than people expected. That's a dangerous thing in communities built on tradition. Evidence makes comfortable people nervous, especially when the evidence comes from someone they already dismissed. One windy afternoon in late March, Amelia drove her ATV into the north pasture, carrying a metal probe thermometer notebook and folding ruler strapped to the back rack. From the highway, she probably looked ridiculous. A 64-year-old widow wandering around dead grass with scientific tools, while everybody else burned pasture and prepared cattle rotations. But Amelia didn't care anymore. Age sometimes frees people from social fear. She stopped near a patch of little blue stem and knelt slowly, knees cracking beneath faded denim. The prairie stretched silent around her, except for wind moving through old grass stalks like dry ocean waves. Amelia pushed aside the residue layer carefully. Beneath it, the soil remained dark, cool, still holding moisture. She inserted the thermometer probe 6 inches down and wrote the temperature into her notebook. Then she measured surface exposure nearby, where wind had stripped grass thinner, warmer already. Faster evaporation, exactly what Harold Bennett predicted 40 years earlier. Amelia sat back slowly and stared across the pasture. The county saw neglect. She saw insulation. And somewhere deep inside her chest, beneath grief and loneliness and exhaustion, something dangerous had started growing. Certainty. If you're still with me, remember this part. Because certainty is lonely when everybody around you believes the opposite. That same evening, Amelia stopped by the old barn Walter built in 1987. The structure leaned slightly west from decades of prairie wind, but it still smelled like cedar posts, diesel fuel, and old leather tack. Inside sat shelves lined with notebooks, dozens of them. Walter had labeled every year carefully. On and on through decades of weather patterns and grazing records. Amelia opened one from 2006 and flipped toward a dry summer entry. North pasture retained green forage 11 days longer than burned south section. Soil beneath residue cooler by 14 degrees at midday. Walter's handwriting slanted harder toward the end of sentences whenever he got excited. Amelia smiled sadly, reading it. Then she cried for the first time in weeks. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly inside an empty barn while Oklahoma wind rattled tin siding overhead. Because grief does strange things. Sometimes it crushes people. Sometimes it clarifies them. Walter had spent years preparing the ranch for hard seasons, and now everybody expected Amelia to abandon the very lessons he died protecting. Outside the barn, Dean Holloway's burn crews lit another pasture less than 2 miles away. Smoke rolled upward into the orange evening sky, while flames crawled fast through dry grass. Most ranchers admired scenes like that. Control, efficiency, fast green up afterward. But Amelia watched differently. She saw exposed soil, lost moisture, biology cooking beneath the surface, not immediately, not dramatically. Slowly. That was the frightening part. Damage on prairie rarely announces itself overnight. It accumulates quietly beneath years of accepted practice. Late that night, Ethan called from Wichita. "You doing all right, I'm standing. You sound tired. I am tired. A long pause followed. Then Ethan asked carefully, You still refusing to burn? Amelia looked toward the dark window above the kitchen sink. Yes, you know everybody thinks it's a mistake. Amelia's voice stayed soft. Most people think immediate results are the same thing as long-term health. What does that mean? It means black dirt looks impressive for about 3 weeks. Ethan sighed heavily. Mom? One hard drought. Amelia interrupted quietly, and bare ground tells the truth. Silence filled the line, because even Ethan, despite his doubts, could hear something in her voice he hadn't heard since Walter died. Conviction. Not emotional grief. Not denial. Conviction built from observation. Outside wind moved through the old grass surrounding Davis Ranch. The county saw dead pasture waiting to fail. Amelia Davis saw a living shield waiting to be tested. And far out across western Oklahoma, the clouds had already begun disappearing. By April, people had stopped calling Amelia Davis stubborn. Now they called her embarrassing. And in a small, rural county, that word cuts deeper. Let me explain something about communities built around agriculture. Farmers and ranchers do not merely compete financially. They compete socially. Whose pasture looks cleaner, whose cattle look heavier, whose fences stand straighter, whose methods appear respectable. Out there on the Oklahoma prairie, appearances become morality faster than most outsiders realize, and Amelia's ranch looked terrible, at least from the highway. While neighboring pastures glowed bright green after spring burns, Davis Ranch still carried broad stretches of standing yellow residue waving across the hillsides. Some areas looked patchy. Others carried tangled mixtures of old grass and emerging native shoots underneath. To most ranchers, it looked neglected, like the property belonged to someone slowly losing control. Dean Holloway made sure people noticed. One Saturday morning at the livestock auction in Clinton, he stood beside the sale ring railing drinking coffee while a group of ranchers discussed pasture conditions. Drove by Davis Ranch yesterday, Dean said casually. Looks like a government weed project. The men laughed. She's still refusing to burn? Dean nodded dramatically, claims she's protecting the soil. Protecting it from what? Apparently from common sense. Even the auctioneer chuckled. Now sit with that scene for a moment. Because public ridicule becomes easier once a community collectively decides someone deserves it. And Amelia Davis had become useful. Useful as an example of what not to become. A widow clinging to strange ideas after her husband died. A rancher whose fields looked messy. A woman refusing advice from men the county considered successful. That combination almost guaranteed mockery. Meanwhile, Amelia kept working. Every morning before sunrise, she rotated cattle carefully through smaller paddocks, using temporary fencing Walter bought years earlier. She moved slower than most ranchers in the county, intentionally limiting grazing pressure on recovering grasses. That confused people even more. Why leave grass standing when cattle could eat it now? Because Amelia was not feeding cattle for one season. She was feeding land for 10 years from now. But long-term thinking looks foolish in a culture obsessed with immediate results, especially during good weather. One afternoon, Hank Mercer drove out to Davis Ranch delivering a replacement water valve Amelia had ordered weeks earlier. He stepped from the truck and stared across the north pasture. Lord, he muttered, looks worse every time I see it. Amelia signed the receipt quietly. Hank shook his head. You know folks are talking. That usually means they're bored. I'm serious, Amelia, so am I. Hank studied her carefully. You really believe this old grass idea is going to save your ranch? Amelia looked toward the pasture. Wind rolled softly through the standing residue while meadowlarks perched along fence wire. I believe bare ground dies faster, she answered. Hank laughed once under his breath. You sound just like your father. That's because he was right. Hank didn't respond immediately, because Harold Bennett's name still carried uncomfortable memories among older ranchers, especially the drought of 1988. Back then, Harold's pastures survived longer than most around Dodge City, while neighboring ranchers sold cattle early. People remembered that. They just preferred not to talk about it. There's another thing communities do when they dislike uncomfortable truths. They bury them beneath newer opinions. That evening, Amelia opened the latest rainfall report from the Oklahoma Mesonet network while eating soup alone at the kitchen table. Below average moisture again. Wind speeds increasing. Subsoil levels dropping across western counties. The numbers worried her. Not emotionally, scientifically. She walked afterward to the mudroom where Walter's old work cap still hung beside the door. Sometimes grief arrives in giant waves. Other times it sneaks up quietly while staring at ordinary objects. Amelia picked up the hat slowly. Dust still lined the inside brim. Walter used to wear it every evening, checking fences before dark. "You seeing this?" she whispered softly into the empty room. "Because loneliness changes how people talk, especially widows." Outside, coyotes barked somewhere beyond the creek pasture. And the prairie kept drying. If you're still with me, pay attention now, because this is where the story begins tightening. Late April brought unusually hot winds across western Oklahoma. Temperatures climbed early. Moisture disappeared faster than expected. Burned pastures greened briefly after spring rains, but shallow-rooted growth began stressing almost immediately once the weather shifted. Amelia noticed first in Dean Holloway's South Range pasture. From the road, she could already see exposed patches forming where wind-stripped loosened topsoil between sparse green shoots. Too much bare ground, too little cover. Meanwhile, Davis Ranch still looked ugly. But underneath that ugly surface, something entirely different was happening. One morning, Amelia drove her ATV into the west pasture carrying a shovel. She stopped near an area cattle had grazed lightly 3 weeks earlier and cut a narrow section into the soil profile. Dark moisture remained several inches down. Roots stretched deeper than expected. Earthworm tunnels threaded through protected ground beneath the old grass layer. Amelia smiled faintly. Then she wrote everything down carefully. Date, temperature, depth, moisture retention. That notebook mattered more to her than most people realized, because records protect you against doubt, and Amelia had spent enough years being dismissed to value proof. But the pressure kept building. Near the beginning of May, Ethan returned from Wichita unexpectedly. He walked the ranch with his mother beneath harsh afternoon sun, while wind rattled dead grass around them. "You can't honestly think this looks okay," he finally said. Amelia kept walking. "What exactly looks wrong?" He gestured toward the pasture. "It looks abandoned. It's covered. It looks unmanaged. It's resting." Ethan stopped walking altogether. "Mom, people are talking about you like you've lost it." Amelia turned slowly. "You drove 3 hours to tell me gossip. I drove 3 hours because I'm worried." His voice cracked slightly. That changed everything. Because beneath frustration, Ethan carried fear. Fear of losing the ranch. Fear of losing his remaining parent. Fear that grief had pushed Amelia into denial. Amelia softened. She reached down, pushed aside old grass, and exposed the soil underneath. Still dark, still holding moisture. "Touch it," she said quietly. Ethan hesitated but crouched beside her. The soil felt cool beneath his fingertips. Not wet, but alive. "Now touch Dean Holloway's pasture next time you drive home." Ethan frowned. "That doesn't prove anything." No, Amelia agreed. Not yet. That answer unsettled him more than certainty would have. Because Amelia wasn't talking like someone desperate to win an argument. She was talking like someone waiting for time to reveal something inevitable. That night, Ethan stayed for dinner. The conversation remained strained, but calmer. Amelia cooked beef stew, while old country music drifted softly from the kitchen radio. Afterward, Ethan wandered into the barn and found the shelves of notebooks for the first time. Hundreds of pages, rainfall charts, grazing maps, temperature readings, Walter's handwriting beside Amelia's. Years of observations. Ethan stood silently flipping pages while dust floated through evening sunlight. His father had never mentioned any of this. Not once. And suddenly Ethan realized something uncomfortable. Maybe he had inherited the ranch emotionally without ever truly understanding it. Outside the barn, dry wind swept across the prairie again. No rain came that week, or the week after. And little by little, the county's laughter began mixing with something else. Nervousness. By early June, Western Oklahoma had stopped talking about rain the way people normally do. They started talking about it like something dying in a hospital room. Quietly, carefully, almost afraid to say the truth out loud. The ponds around Custer County had already dropped several inches lower than usual. Windmills squealed longer each afternoon. Dust began collecting along fence rows where spring grass should have thickened by now. And for the first time that year, ranchers stopped laughing quite so loudly at Amelia Davis. Not because they suddenly respected her, because they had started worrying about themselves. Now let me tell you something about drought. It rarely arrives dramatically at first. It creeps. A little less green each week, a little more dust behind truck tires, a little longer between meaningful rains. Then one morning you wake up and realize the entire landscape has quietly shifted into survival mode. Amelia noticed it earlier than most. That was the advantage of paying attention to the ground instead of the calendar. One hot morning before sunrise, she drove out to the western paddocks carrying her notebook and metal probe again. The sky already held that pale, white color Oklahoma summers get before brutal heat settles in for the day. Her cattle moved slowly through the pasture, calm and spread out. That mattered. Overstressed cattle bunched together more tightly near water and shade during heat stress. Walter had taught her to watch animal behavior before checking pasture conditions. "The cattle tell you what the land's doing," he used to say. Amelia stepped down from the ATV and pushed aside old standing grass near a slope where the sun hit hardest. The soil underneath still held moisture. Not much, but enough. Cooler than exposed ground. Protected. She checked another spot, then another. Consistent. Amelia sat back on her heels and looked across the pasture as wind moved softly through the old residue cover. That ugly grass everybody mocked. It was slowing evaporation exactly the way Harold Bennett predicted decades ago. If you're still with me, this is where the story begins turning. Not publicly yet. Quietly. The truth almost always starts quietly. 3 miles east, Dean Holloway was having a very different morning. His south pasture had greened beautifully after spring burns in March. Fast early growth, clean appearance, perfect grazing conditions by April. Exactly the kind of pasture ranchers proudly showed off from truck windows. But by June, cracks had begun opening across exposed sections of soil where cover had thinned. The grass roots stayed shallow. Heat hammered the bare ground directly, and every windy afternoon carried away more moisture. Dean noticed it. Of course he noticed it. Good ranchers always notice problems before they admit them publicly. That morning he stood beside a dried stock pond with Travis Boone from the extension office. "You think we ought to start rotating earlier?" Dean asked. Travis kicked at the dirt. "Maybe reduce pressure some." Dean frowned. "We're barely into summer." Neither man said the word drought yet. Farmers are superstitious about that. Saying it aloud makes it feel real. Meanwhile, Amelia kept doing what looked from the outside almost absurdly slow. She rotated cattle carefully every few days through smaller paddocks, using temporary fencing. She left more residual grass standing after grazing than neighboring ranches considered acceptable. And she watched the ground constantly. One afternoon, Hank Mercer stopped by again, delivering mineral tubs. This time he looked uneasy. "Been dry over our place too," he admitted while unloading supplies. Amelia nodded. "Ground's opening up already. You seeing it? I expected it." Hank leaned against the truck bed. "You really think that dead grass is helping?" Amelia bent down and pulled apart the residue layer again. Underneath the soil remained darker than surrounding exposed ground. "Feel it," she said. Hank crouched reluctantly, his rough fingers pressed into the dirt. Cool. Not wet exactly, but protected. He stared for a second longer than before. "Well," he muttered carefully, "I'll be damned. Now sit with that moment." because belief rarely changes all at once. It shifts through discomfort first. Hank stood up, brushing dirt from his jeans. Still looks ugly as sin, though. Amelia smiled faintly. Most useful things do eventually. That answer stayed with him long after he drove away. By mid-June, heat settled over Oklahoma like a lid. 98 degrees, then 101, then 104. Wind carried dust across county roads every afternoon. Ranchers began hauling supplemental feed earlier than normal because pasture recovery slowed badly after the weak spring rains disappeared. At Mercer Feed and Supply, the conversations changed tone completely. Less joking, more calculating. How much hay you got left? You hearing anything about July forecasts? Ponds dropping fast over by Thomas. Dean Holloway still spoke confidently in public, but privately he had already started adjusting stocking numbers. Fear was creeping in, and fear changes people faster than evidence ever will. Late one evening, Ethan called his mother again from Wichita. You okay out there? Amelia stood at the kitchen sink watching sunset light spread across the pasture. I'm all right. I saw drought maps on the news. News finally caught up. That bad? Amelia paused, then answered honestly. Could get bad? Ethan hesitated. Should I come help for a while? That surprised her. Not because she needed help, because he finally sounded like someone seeing the ranch instead of judging it. We're all right for now, she said softly. A long silence passed. Then Ethan asked quietly, how did Dad know? Amelia closed her eyes briefly. Knew what about the grass? She looked toward Walter's notebooks stacked near the kitchen shelf. He watched, she answered. That's all, but nobody else seems to see what you see. Amelia gave the smallest sad smile. Most people look for fast results. And you don't. No, she said quietly. Your father taught me to look for what survives hard years. That sentence settled heavily between them, because easy seasons make almost everybody look smart. Hard seasons expose the difference between appearance and resilience. Out on the prairie, that difference can decide who keeps their ranch. A week later, Travis Boone returned unexpectedly to Davis Ranch. This time he arrived alone. No county clipboard, no official tone. Just curiosity. Amelia found him kneeling near the edge of her west pasture, inspecting the soil himself. He stood awkwardly when she approached. Sorry, he said. I was looking. That's usually how people learn. Travis glanced across the field. Dean's South Range is stressing pretty hard. Amelia said nothing. The surface temperatures out there are getting ugly. Still, she remained quiet. Finally, Travis looked directly at her. You really think residue cover alone is making this much difference? Amelia took a slow breath. Not alone. What else roots? Soil biology, reduced evaporation, less wind exposure, better water infiltration during wet years. She looked down at the pasture. Everything people can't see immediately. Travis stared across the waving old grass. For the first time all year, he no longer looked skeptical. He looked unsettled. Because deep down, educated people fear one thing more than ignorance. They fear realizing someone they dismissed was right. And across Custer County, the prairie itself had started delivering evidence. The ugly ranch still held moisture. The clean ranches were beginning to crack apart. The drought announced itself officially in July. Not through rain gauges, through cattle auctions. Let me tell you something every ranching community understands instinctively. When proud men start selling healthy cattle, early fear has already arrived. By the second week of July, trailers lined up outside the livestock yard in Clinton before sunrise. Ranchers who normally held calves until fall suddenly pushed animals through sale rings months ahead of schedule. Too little grass, too little water, too much heat. Nobody used the word panic publicly, but panic hung in the air anyway. Dust rolled through parking lots like smoke, while exhausted cattle bawled inside holding pens under brutal afternoon temperatures. Auctioneers talked faster than usual because everyone wanted to move animals before prices collapsed further. And among all those worried conversations, one subject kept surfacing. Amelia Davis. Not mockingly anymore. Cautiously. "You drove by her place lately. Heard she still got standing forage. No way. That's what Travis Boone said. People didn't know what to believe, because Davis Ranch violated what the county thought it understood about grass management. The ugly pasture was surviving. The clean ones were failing. Now sit with that for a moment, because there's nothing more unsettling to a community than watching reality embarrass tradition in real time." Dean Holloway felt that embarrassment hardest. 3 of his stock ponds had already dropped dangerously low. The South Range pasture, once the pride of his operation after spring burning, now looked exhausted beneath relentless heat and wind. The exposed ground between grass clumps widened every week. Cracks opened across hillsides. And worst of all, dust storms had started lifting topsoil. One afternoon, Dean stood beside a fence line watching wind carry thin sheets of dirt across the pasture he once bragged about at the coffee counter. He looked older suddenly. Not physically, spiritually, because failure ages people fastest when it attacks their certainty. His ranch hand, Cole Ramsey, walked up beside him. "We're gonna have to cut numbers again." Dean stared silently across the pasture. "How much hay left? Maybe 3 weeks if we stretch it." Dean rubbed his jaw hard. Across the road, visible beyond 2 fence lines, Amelia Davis's north pasture still held standing cover. Not lush, not miraculous, but alive. And Dean hated looking at it. Not because it embarrassed him publicly, because deep down it forced him to question whether he'd misunderstood the land for years. Meanwhile, Amelia kept moving quietly through her routines. Every morning before sunrise, she rotated cattle carefully into fresh sections, while temperatures still hovered below 90 degrees. She checked troughs, monitored grazing pressure, recorded observations inside her notebooks beneath Walter's old lamp each evening. No celebration, no speeches, no "I told you so." That mattered. Because truly experienced people understand something prideful people never learn. When reality proves you right, you do not need to announce it. The land speaks loudly enough. If you're still with me, pay attention now. Because this next part changed the county forever. Late July brought the first major windstorm. Not rain, wind. 45-mile-per-hour gusts hammered western Oklahoma for nearly 2 straight days, beneath temperatures above 103 degrees. Burned pastures suffered immediately. Loose, exposed topsoil lifted into the air in long brown sheets stretching across highways and county roads. Visibility dropped in open areas, while fence lines collected drifts of dry dirt like snowbanks. People started driving slower past certain ranches out of shock alone. Dean Holloway's south pasture looked wounded. The top layer had literally begun leaving. But when the wind crossed Davis Ranch, something different happened. The standing old grass slowed the gusts near the surface. Residue cover shielded the soil from direct exposure. Root systems held ground together beneath the protective layer. The pasture bent. But it stayed. Amelia watched from her porch as the storm rolled through at sunset. Dust clouds darkened the western horizon, while dead grass whispered violently against itself across the prairie. Walter would have understood this moment immediately. She could almost hear him saying it. Armor. That's what he called standing residue during drought years. Not waste. Armor. That night, Ethan called again. This time his voice sounded frightened. "You all right out there?" "We're fine. I saw the dust storm reports." Amelia looked through the kitchen window toward the pasture glowing silver beneath moonlight. Ground held. Ethan hesitated. "Mom." "Yes, I drove past Dean Holloway's place today." She stayed quiet. It looked bad. "Yes," Amelia answered softly. "It probably is." Another silence settled between them. Then Ethan asked the question that had been growing inside him for weeks. "Did Dad know this was coming?" Amelia looked toward the notebooks stacked beside the table. "No," she said carefully. "But he believed drought always comes eventually. And the grass was preparation." That sentence hit Ethan harder than she realized, because suddenly the ranch stopped looking like random habits inherited from old people. It became something else entirely. A long-term survival strategy. The next morning, Travis Boone called an emergency county meeting at the extension office regarding drought management and stocking recommendations. The room filled quickly. Sweaty ranchers in dust-covered caps packed folding chairs, while industrial fans pushed hot air around uselessly overhead. Everyone looked tired and worried. Travis stood near a whiteboard showing rainfall deficits and forage projections. "It's getting worse faster than expected," he admitted. "We need aggressive conservation measures now." Questions came immediately. How long's this gonna last? What are we hearing from NOAA? When do we start emergency assistance requests? Then someone near the back asked the question nobody wanted asked publicly. What about Amelia Davis's place? The room went quiet. Travis hesitated. That hesitation alone changed everything. Finally, he answered carefully. "Her pasture conditions are currently outperforming surrounding operations." Murmurs spread instantly. Dean Holloway sat stiffly near the wall, jaw clenched. One rancher scoffed. "You saying not burning actually helped?" Travis chose his next words cautiously. "I'm saying residue cover appears to have reduced moisture loss significantly." Silence again. Because suddenly this was no longer about one widow with strange ideas. Now it threatened the county's identity. For generations, ranchers burned pasture, believing clean ground meant healthier grazing, and now a drought was exposing something deeply uncomfortable. Maybe appearance and resilience were not the same thing. After the meeting ended, several ranchers drove past Davis Ranch, slowly on purpose. Nobody laughed anymore. They studied. That evening, Amelia stood in the west pasture watching cattle graze calmly through standing forage while sunset painted the prairie copper and gold. The grass still looked rough compared to manicured burned pasture, but it remained functional, alive. Wind moved gently across the hills, carrying the smell of dry earth and distant dust storms. Amelia bent down once more and pressed her hand beneath the residue layer. Cool soil met her fingertips. Not miracle soil, not magic. Protected soil. That was the difference. Now, let me pause here, because stories like this are never really about grass, or drought, or ranching techniques. They're about something much older. The danger of confusing popularity with wisdom. And out on the Oklahoma prairie, that confusion was finally starting to collapse. The county inspection happened on an afternoon so hot, the fence posts themselves seemed tired. 106 degrees. No meaningful rain in nearly 11 weeks. Western Oklahoma had turned the color of old bone. Pastures across Custer County looked exhausted now. Not just dry, exposed. The difference mattered. You could drive for miles and see bare dirt widening between thinning grasses while cattle clustered desperately around shrinking water sources. Dust-coated highway signs. Ponds resembled muddy scars in the earth. And then there was Davis Ranch, still ugly, still yellow, still standing. Now let me tell you something about human nature. People will mock you confidently for months, but the moment they suspect you might have been right, they show up quietly to inspect the evidence themselves. That Thursday, trucks began arriving outside Amelia Davis's ranch gate before noon. County officials, extension agents, ranchers pretending they were just curious. Even Dean Holloway came, though he parked farther back than the others. Nobody joked anymore. The heat had burned arrogance out of the county. Amelia watched them gather from her porch without expression. She wore Walter's old straw hat and carried one of the black notebooks tucked beneath her arm. Travis Boone stepped forward first. "Appreciate you letting us come out." Amelia nodded once. "Land's not private from weather," she said. "Might as well learn from it." That answer lingered in the silence afterward, because nobody there had come expecting generosity. Most assumed Amelia would enjoy humiliating them. Truthfully, part of her probably could have. After months of ridicule, gossip, and condescension, few people would blame her for bitterness. But Amelia Davis belonged to a generation that believed the land itself was larger than personal pride, and drought had a way of humbling everyone eventually. If you're still with me, pay attention carefully now, because this next scene became county legend afterward. The group followed Amelia into the north pasture beneath brutal sunlight. Dry wind swept through the standing old grass, while grasshoppers snapped through the air ahead of their boots. Several ranchers looked uncomfortable already. Not physically, emotionally. Because the pasture did not match what they expected. Yes, the grass remained tall and uneven. Yes, some residue still stood waist-high. But beneath that rough appearance, the field held something surrounding ranches no longer had. Coverage? Life? Protection? Amelia stopped near a gently sloping section overlooking the creek pasture. Then she handed Travis Boone a metal soil probe. Push it down. Travis drove the probe into the ground. It slid farther than expected. A few ranchers exchanged glances immediately. Now, that might not sound dramatic to city people listening to this story, but ranchers know soil resistance instinctively. Hard, dry ground fights back. Protected ground yields differently. Travis pulled the probe free slowly. Dark soil clung several inches down. Not powder, not dust. Actual moisture. Dean Holloway stepped closer unconsciously. "You hit a low spot?" he asked quietly. Amelia shook her head. "No." She walked 20 feet farther uphill. "Try here." Travis pushed again. Same result. Then another location. And another. Each time the probe entered deeper than expected for late July during severe drought. Finally, Amelia crouched down and swept aside the old grass cover with both hands. Dark earth appeared underneath, cooler than surface air, protected from direct exposure. One rancher actually muttered, "Jesus Christ." Nobody laughed. Not one person. Because suddenly they were no longer looking at theory. They were looking at evidence. Now sit with that moment for a second. The county had mocked this woman for months because her pasture looked ugly. And now those same ugly fields were outperforming the polished ones collapsing all around them. Amelia opened one of the notebooks carefully. "This section," she said quietly, "hasn't been fully burned in 6 years." Pages flipped beneath the hot wind. Average soil temperature under residue cover runs lower during extreme heat periods. Water infiltration improved after rotational grazing adjustments in 2017. She pointed toward another handwritten chart. Earthworm counts increased after reducing exposed ground. The ranchers stared silently, because the notebook changed everything. This wasn't stubborn grief. This wasn't emotional attachment. This was 14 years of disciplined observation. Dean Holloway stepped closer. "You tracked all this?" Amelia looked up calmly. "Walter and I both did." The mention of Walter softened something in the crowd immediately, because many of those men respected him once, and now suddenly they realized Walter Davis might have understood something years before the county did. Travis Boone wiped sweat from his forehead. "You're saying the standing residue reduced evaporation enough to preserve subsoil moisture?" "Through this heat," Amelia nodded. "Residue shields the surface, slows wind exposure, protects biology. Roots stay alive longer." One rancher frowned skeptically. "But burned pasture greens faster." "Yes," Amelia agreed. "For a while." That answer landed harder than any speech could have. Because everybody there had already witnessed the second half of the sentence themselves. Fast green up, then collapse. The county stood quietly beneath the crushing Oklahoma heat, while wind moved through the standing old grass around them. And for the first time all summer, nobody cared how ugly the pasture looked. They cared that it survived. If you're still with me, remember this carefully. Vindication rarely feels loud when it finally arrives. Sometimes it feels strangely quiet, almost sad, because Amelia took no pleasure in what the drought had done to neighboring ranches. She understood too much about hardship for that. Dean Holloway removed his cap slowly and stared across the pasture. "I burned too hard," he admitted softly. Nobody answered, because they all had. That was the terrible truth emerging across western Oklahoma. The county hadn't merely followed tradition. They had stripped away protection during the exact years the climate was becoming harsher. And Amelia Davis, the widow they mocked as outdated and foolish, had accidentally become the only rancher preparing correctly for the future. Late that afternoon, the group walked toward the creek section. To everyone's shock, shallow water still moved through parts of it. Not much, but enough to matter. One rancher whispered, "Our creek went dry 2 weeks ago." Amelia looked toward the water. Covered soil holds rainfall longer. Dean laughed bitterly under his breath. All this time we thought clean ground meant healthy pasture. Amelia turned toward him carefully. Clean isn't the same thing as alive. The sentence spread across the county faster than any official report afterward. By sunset, people at Mercer Feed and Supply were already repeating it. Clean isn't the same thing as alive. Travis Boone stayed behind after the others left. The heat softened slightly, while evening shadows stretched long across the prairie. "You know they'll want researchers out here now," he said. Amelia nodded. "That's all right. You could have embarrassed every one of us today." Amelia looked toward the hills. The Drought already did that. Travis stared at her for several seconds. Then finally he asked the question he should have asked months earlier. "How did you know?" Amelia stood quietly, while wind moved through the standing old grass surrounding them. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I watched. Now let me pause here. Because that may be the most important sentence in this entire story. The world is full of loud people desperate to sound certain. But the people who truly understand land watch first. And long before the county admitted it publicly, the prairie had already decided Amelia Davis was right. By August, Amelia Davis had become the most uncomfortable subject in western Oklahoma, not because people hated her anymore, because they could no longer dismiss her. And there's a difference. Mockery is easy. Respect after humiliation is harder, especially in places where pride runs deep. Now, let me tell you what happened after the county inspection. The story escaped Custer County faster than anyone expected. First came neighboring ranchers quietly driving past Davis Ranch at dusk, slowing near the fences to study the standing forage for themselves. Then came Extension Office phone calls from other counties asking Travis Boone about the residue pasture woman. A week later, researchers from Oklahoma State University arrived in 2 white trucks, carrying soil probes, moisture meters, infrared thermometers, and graduate students pale enough to reveal immediately they spent more time in laboratories than pastures. The county watched all of it closely. Because nothing changes public opinion faster than outside experts taking someone seriously, especially someone local people once laughed at openly. The lead researcher was Dr. Caroline Mercer, a rangeland ecologist in her 50s, with wind-burned skin and boots dusty enough to earn immediate respect from ranchers. That mattered too. Out on the prairie, people trust dirt on boots more than titles. Dr. Mercer spent nearly 6 hours walking Davis Ranch with Amelia beneath brutal summer heat. They compared residue-covered pasture against nearby burned sections across neighboring properties. The numbers shocked even the researchers. Lower surface temperatures, higher retained moisture, better root preservation, more active biological structure beneath the soil surface, and perhaps most importantly, less erosion. That last part hit the county hardest, because by late August, dust storms had stripped alarming amounts of topsoil from exposed ranch land throughout the region. One afternoon, Dean Holloway stood silently beside his western fence line, staring at drifts of his own soil piled against cedar breaks after another hard windstorm. The land itself had started moving away from him. You never forget seeing that happen. If you're still with me, understand something important now. The emotional turning point in this story was not Amelia proving she was smarter than everyone else. It was the county realizing how much damage pride had already caused. At Mercer Feed and Supply, the conversation sounded completely different now. Gone were the jokes about the grass widow. Gone were the coffee counter comments about weeds and neglect. Instead, people asked questions quietly. How long did she say they left residue standing? You think rotational grazing mattered too? Could we recover if we stopped burning now? Hank Mercer listened more than he talked these days. One evening after closing the store, he drove out to Davis Ranch alone. Amelia found him standing near the north fence, watching cattle graze calmly through the remaining forage. "I owe you an apology," he said without turning around. Amelia leaned against the gate. For what? Hank gave a tired laugh. Oh, probably 50 different things. Wind moved softly through the old grass around them. I called you crazy, he admitted. Yes, Amelia said gently. You did. You gonna hold that against me? Amelia looked across the pasture before answering. Hank Drought's hard enough without people keeping score. Now sit with that moment. Because that answer revealed more about Amelia Davis than any victory speech ever could. The county had spent months humiliating her publicly, but hardship had carved something deeper into her than bitterness. Perspective. People who truly understand land often understand people, too. Both can survive mistakes if treated carefully enough. Meanwhile, Ethan Davis returned from Wichita again, this time staying nearly a full week. But something had changed in him now. Before he walked the ranch looking for problems. Now he walked it looking for understanding. One evening, he sat at the kitchen table flipping through Walter's notebooks, while Amelia cooked supper quietly nearby. These records go back 14 years, he said softly. Longer if you count your grandfather's. Ethan looked up. You never showed me any of this. Amelia stopped stirring the pot. You never asked. That answer hit him hard, because it was true. As a boy, Ethan loved the ranch emotionally, but ignored the deeper systems underneath it. He cared about cattle, horses, machinery. Walter cared about soil biology. At the time, Ethan thought his father obsessed over dirt too much. Now he realized Walter had been studying survival itself. Ethan opened another notebook. What's this? Root depth measurements after rotational recovery periods. You measured roots. Your father did most of it. Ethan shook his head slowly in disbelief. No one around here ranches like this. No, Amelia agreed quietly. That's why most of them are hauling hay. Silence filled the kitchen. Not hostile silence, heavy silence. The kind that arrives when someone realizes wisdom stood nearby their entire life unnoticed. Later that night, Ethan walked alone to the north pasture beneath a sky crowded with stars. The prairie smelled dry but alive. Crickets hummed through standing grass, while cattle shifted softly in the darkness beyond the hill. Ethan crouched down and pushed aside the residue layer the same way his mother always did. Cooler soil touched his fingertips. And for the first time in his adult life, he finally understood what Walter Davis had spent decades protecting. Not grass, resilience. The next Sunday, Fellowship Baptist Church held a community prayer gathering for rain. Nearly the entire county attended. Farmers, ranchers, families exhausted by heat and financial pressure. And when Amelia Davis walked into the church fellowship hall, something remarkable happened. People moved toward her. Not away. Dean Holloway approached first. He looked thinner now, more tired. Sunburned across the neck from weeks of emergency work trying to stabilize failing pasture. Amelia, he said quietly. She nodded politely. Dean struggled for words. That alone shocked anyone who knew him. Finally, he said I was wrong. No excuses. No qualifications. Just that. Amelia studied his face carefully. Pride still existed there, but Drought had cracked it open enough for honesty. We all miss things sometimes, she answered softly. Dean shook his head. No, I mocked you because I thought you were weak. The room had grown quiet around them now. People listened without pretending otherwise. Dean swallowed hard. Truth is, you understood the land better than the rest of us. Now let me pause here. Because men like Dean Holloway are not built to say sentences like that publicly. It cost him something. But perhaps that's what real humility always costs. Amelia did not smile triumphantly, did not embarrass him, did not remind him of every cruel joke spoken months earlier. She simply said, the prairie teaches everybody eventually. And somehow that made the room even quieter. By September, Oklahoma State published preliminary findings from Davis Ranch, showing significant drought resilience linked to standing residue management and rotational grazing recovery strategies. Suddenly, reporters started calling. Agricultural magazines requested interviews. County officials who once warned Amelia privately now asked whether she would host educational field visits. The same ranch once called abandoned had become a demonstration site, but Amelia refused to turn herself into a celebrity. No social media, no dramatic interviews, no expert branding. Every morning she still woke before sunrise, walked the pasture-checked water levels, and wrote observations beneath Walter's lamp, because truly wise people understand something attention seekers never do. The goal is not being admired. The goal is keeping the land alive. And across western Oklahoma, more and more ranchers had finally begun understanding that too. The rain finally came in October. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just a slow gray storm rolling across western Oklahoma after months of heat and dust and worry. People stepped onto porches across Custer County that morning just to listen, because after enough drought, rain stops sounding like weather. It starts sounding like mercy. Amelia Davis stood alone near the north pasture fence while cold drops darkened the shoulders of Walter's old canvas coat. Wind bent the standing grass gently beneath the storm, while water disappeared into the covered soil instead of racing across hardened ground. That mattered too. Protected land receives rain differently. Now let me tell you something beautiful about the prairie. If you care for it long enough, it remembers, not emotionally, biologically. Roots survive. Microbial systems recover. Native grasses return stronger after hardship. The land responds to protection the way people respond to kindness. Slowly. Then, all at once. By the following spring, Davis Ranch had become something nobody in the county ever expected: a classroom. Pickup trucks from neighboring counties started arriving twice a month for informal pasture walks Amelia hosted with Oklahoma State researchers. Ranchers walked her fields while she explained residue cover rotational recovery root systems and moisture retention with the same calm voice she once used teaching biology decades earlier. Only now people listened carefully. Very carefully. Funny how suffering sharpens attention. Dean Holloway attended every session. That surprised people most of all. The proudest man in the county carrying a notebook behind the widow he once mocked publicly. But drought had changed Dean permanently. Humility often arrives disguised as financial pain. One afternoon after a field tour ended, Dean stayed behind, helping Amelia repair temporary fencing along the west pasture. The sky stretched wide and blue above them, while meadowlarks balanced on fence posts nearby. Dean tightened a wire clip slowly. "You know," he said, "I used to think clean pasture meant disciplined ranching." Amelia smiled faintly. "A lot of people did." Dean shook his head. "No, I believed it like religion." She nodded. "That's the danger with inherited ideas." Dean looked across the grassland. "My father burned every spring, his father too, and sometimes traditions survive longer than the conditions that created them." Now sit with that sentence for a moment, because that truth reaches far beyond ranching. A lot of people inherit habits from another era without ever questioning whether the world changed underneath them. Amelia understood that. Walter understood it too. And now, finally, so did the county. If you're still with me, here's where the story becomes something larger than vindication. Because Amelia Davis did not merely save her ranch. She changed how people around her thought about stewardship itself. The county extension office eventually partnered with Oklahoma State to establish demonstration plots across several local ranches, testing residue retention and rotational grazing systems modeled partly after Davis Ranch observations. That sentence sounds technical, but let me translate it plainly. The woman everybody laughed at became the blueprint. And perhaps the most emotional moment of all came quietly one evening in late March, nearly a year after the drought began. Ethan Davis returned home for good. Not temporarily, not to help out. Home. He arrived with a rented trailer carrying furniture tools and a little girl with Walter Davis's eyes. 6-year-old Clara Davis, Amelia's granddaughter. The child stepped carefully from the truck while spring wind moved softly across recovering pasture around the ranch. "You really live here?" Grandma, she asked. Amelia smiled. "I surely do. Clara stared wide-eyed across the prairie. It's huge. Ethan walked slowly toward his mother afterward, while movers unloaded boxes nearby. You were right, he said quietly. Amelia shook her head. No, yes, Ethan insisted, about all of it. She looked toward the pasture. The land was right. I just listened longer. That answer nearly broke him, because Ethan finally understood something painful. His parents had spent decades building knowledge quietly, while he chased speed growth and modern efficiency elsewhere. Not because he was foolish, because modern culture teaches people to value production more than resilience. The drought exposed the difference brutally. That night the family ate dinner together beneath the same warm kitchen light, where Walter once studied rainfall reports and soil charts. For the first time since Walter died, laughter returned to the house naturally. Not forced, not guilty, alive. After supper, Clara wandered toward the notebook cabinet near the pantry. What are these? Amelia walked over slowly and opened one. Those are stories. Clara frowned. They don't look like stories. Amelia smiled softly. Some stories are written in numbers first. She lifted the child into her lap and pointed toward old rainfall entries written decades earlier in Walter's handwriting. That one helped save the ranch. Clara touched the page carefully, like it mattered. Because it did. Outside spring grass had already begun emerging beneath the standing residue left from winter. Not because the land had been stripped clean, because it had been protected long enough to recover. Months later, the county officially renamed the annual Conservation Field Day as the Davis Prairie Gathering. Amelia protested at first. She hated attention. But Travis Boone insisted. People need to remember how this started, and every year afterward, ranchers gathered beneath white tents near the north pasture, while Amelia spoke quietly about soil cover, drought resilience, root systems, and patience. Always patience. Young ranchers asked technical questions. Older ranchers mostly listened, many of them carrying private regret. Because wisdom recognized too late has a certain sadness attached to it. One evening, after the third annual gathering ended, Amelia walked alone toward the hill overlooking the creek pasture. The sun sank low across western Oklahoma, turning the prairie gold beneath moving wind. Grass swayed softly across the land everybody once called ugly. Only now people described it differently. Healthy, resilient, alive. Amelia stopped near the fence and crouched slowly, joints stiff with age now. Then she pushed aside the standing grass the same way she had done 1,000 times before. Dark soil waited underneath, cool, protected, living. She closed her eyes briefly, and for one fleeting second she could almost feel Walter beside her again. Not as grief, as legacy. Now let me pause here one final time, because this story was never really about winning an argument. It was about understanding something most people learn too late. The world often mocks what protects us quietly. Patience, humility, preparation, careful observation. Slow work, nobody applauds at first. But when hard years arrive, and they always do, the loudest, people are rarely the ones still standing. Out on the Oklahoma prairie, an old widow understood that before anyone else. And because she did, the land survived. Some of the most important things in life do not look impressive at first. Patience doesn't look exciting. Quiet preparation doesn't attract applause. And people who spend years protecting something slowly are often mistaken for people standing still. That's what makes Amelia Davis's story matter far beyond one ranch in Oklahoma. While everyone else chased quick results and clean appearances, she protected the invisible things underneath the roots, the moisture, the living soil no one bothered to notice until hardship arrived. And maybe that's true for people too. Some of us are carrying values the world laughs at right now. Humility, discipline, loyalty, care, long-term thinking. The kind of quiet wisdom that rarely wins attention in easy seasons. But hard seasons reveal the truth. They reveal what was real all along. Now let me leave you with this thought. The strongest things in life are often the things growing where nobody is looking. If this story meant something to you, or reminded you of someone who kept going while the world doubted them, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd genuinely love to hear what part stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy deep stories about resilience, hard-earned wisdom, quiet revenge, and people who prove everyone wrong without losing their humanity, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for the next story.